Hi, thank you for clicking on this video. Today, we'll be talking about national identity and black people in the UK. We can be seen as black, as British, as both, as neither. All of these terms, however, are loaded culturally, historically, emotionally, and legally. Where do we belong? How are we excluded? We arrived at these shores via a range of ways and throughout many eras in history. Many of us identify to some extent with our countries of descent, with or without also viewing ourselves as British. As well as the relatively recent catch-all term of Black British, formal categorising traditionally follows three main groups: Black African, Black Caribbean/West Indian, and Black Other. According to data from the UK census of 2011, we're due for more recent data from last year's census very soon. There were about 1 million people who self-identified as Black African, about 600,000 who self-identified as Black Caribbean, and about 280,000 who identified as Black Other. Because of the topics I'm covering in today's video, I'll also include mixed race people. So, you had about 165,000 who were white and Black African, and you had about 430,000 who were white and Black Caribbean. Sorry to the Blasians out there, they're not collecting data on you guys apparently. In fact, none of the categories are great, and it's been hard trying to find data, for example, on numbers by place of birth. In fact, a recent survey conducted by the Black British Voices project received about 11,000 responses. This was last year. And so the report from that survey is being released this year, and I'm looking forward to seeing the results from that report. That said, let's get on with the matter at hand. Just to be clear, I'm going to be focusing specifically on national identity as opposed to cultural practice, because I feel like cultural practice, if I was to add that to this video, it would make it extremely long. It's a very complicated and granular topic, and I think it warrants its own space and perhaps even a separate video. That said, obviously, there's going to be a huge amount of overlap between cultural expression or behaviour and national identity. So there are going to be times when I mention cultural practice and behaviour in this video because they're not entirely separable. Belonging is defined as an affinity for a place or situation. Love and belonging places third on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and argues that a failure to belong results in maladjustment and emotional distress. The Western interpretation of belonging ultimately derives from early Greek and Roman philosophy. The Psychology of Belonging by Kellyanne Allen describes how we find meaning in identity and relevance and satisfaction in our life for a sense of belonging, whether it's via friends and family, groups, or communities. A strong sense of belonging has a positive influence on being successful and functioning. And it is well known that being ostracized and excluded is painful and negatively affects well-being. A sense of belonging is not only associated with people, but with concepts, experiences, places, and land. Also, the experience of belonging, or the lack thereof, can be felt more intensely among those who are already minoritized or racialized. Conversely, to be excluded is to be denied access to a place, group, or privilege. As described in Hilary Silver's Social Inclusion, social exclusion is the process of reduced participation and is a sign of inadequate social integration, bringing economic and social deprivation together. As a term, it first came up in French Durkheimian sociology, with Durkheim being a famous French sociologist from the 19th and 20th century. Finally, a use for my sociology A-level. In a British context, the UK Social Exclusion Unit rather helpfully defines it as, quote, a shorthand label for what can happen when individuals or areas suffer from a combination of linked problems. Typical research sees transnational analysis as only being relevant when applied to the first generation, without doing similar with their host country-born children. This is because of a common assumption that from generation 1.5 onwards, people will be more influenced by and attached to their host country. These generations are also often viewed in a vacuum from the immigrant generations in their families. In Roots and Roots, Understanding the Lives of the Second Generation Transnationally by Peggy Levitt, she argues that the effect of being in a transnational setting should not be overlooked. In American policy, there's already a lot detailing the experiences of immigrants' children, but this data is collected entirely within the United States and takes transnational analysis in a shallow approach in terms of looking at things like children not knowing their parents' mother tongue as evidence that transnationalism is of little relevance among this group. However, those who specialise in transnational analysis, like Levitt, take the approach of collecting data both from the host nation and the country of origin one way or another, and this produces much different results. Bringing it back to the UK, I'm going to be looking at two separate findings from 2008. one conducted by Louise Waite and Joanne Cook, looking at the emotional ties to back home among a group of first and second generation Somali, Zimbabwean, Kenyan and Sudanese immigrants living in the north of England. The second, conducted by Tracy Reynolds, where she interviewed second and third generation young adults and their families located in the UK, Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica and St. Kitts and Nevis, including some who had relocated to the Caribbean. In Louise Waite and Joanne Cook's study, these nations were selected because they were all at some point under British rule historically. This is the case for the majority of black people living in the UK, as is the case for other large non-white groups such as South Asians. The participants had gone through a range of different migration experiences. Some were refugees, some were EU citizens, some were students, some were migrant workers, and some had joined family who were already living here. When asking the first generation about their identity, they tended to describe it as layered or tiered with their birth nation and their new one. However, there were a few instances where people explicitly distanced themselves from their African identity, and this actually correlated with having gone through the arduous refugee process, an environment with policies surrounding neo-assimilation. Neo-assimilation being the theory that from the second generation onwards, they're likely to take on the values of their new host nation more if there are no newcomers coming in from their home country, and so migration from these home nations is blocked. In UK refugee policy, this is interpreted with whiteness being at the core of Britishness and British values. To contrast, those who'd had less traumatic roots into the UK tended to self-describe as retaining a strong sense of identity aligning with their birth nation. The first generation participants in this study also often expressed intentions of returning home, which is a concept I'm going to go into more detail in a bit. Second generation participants, on the other hand, described feelings of both non-belonging and exclusion in both their home nation and the UK. There was a relationship between immigration status and inclusion and exclusion in the UK, as there are different rights afforded depending on whether the person has refugee versus migrant worker status, for example. I'll go into more detail on that as well later. While some of the participants did feel that the UK was home, most described an identity with a lot more nuance. Multiple identities, not unlike the first generation participants. Ancestral homeland identities and emotional belonging may not be as deeply rooted compared to their immigrant parents, but the study does present an image of, quote, indirect, almost by osmosis membership of the homeland community. In Tracy Reynolds' study, the vast majority of second and third generation participants ethnically identified with the Caribbean and continue to affiliate with the lands of their grandparents and parents. Similar to the examples in the African research group, this affiliation is mostly through deliberate effort to create and maintain ties with the extended family wherever they live in the world. Interviewees describe how they express their culture through things like food and family visits back home. Additionally, there is the pervasive myth of return which came up in both research groups. The myth of return stems from the founding generation often, at least initially, having intentions to eventually return, and this intention filtering down to their children. This combines with nostalgia to form an integral part of their children's lives, the foundation of understanding of their own identities and senses of self. It is powerful and present from birth. The second generation interviewees grew up hearing stories of a distant back home, and this formed some of their earliest memories of family. Thus, they chose to identify with the Caribbean with or without having ever been or lived there, and at the very least, it was seen as a cultural or spiritual homeland. Now, why did the emotional pull of myth of return persist in both research groups beyond the first generation? Why did those that actually left to go back feel like they didn't belong in the UK? Funnily enough, recently, black people have largely been omitted from recent conversations about social cohesion and integration. We have politicians, athletes, entertainers with established prominence in the British consciousness. People have even been complaining that they're seeing too much of us, that we're being overrepresented in things like adverts, despite the fact that this is a very recent development on the back of corporations reacting to Black Lives Matter. There are many aspects of our various cultures that don't clash with British culture and may even fit in quite well, which is probably a combination of a hangover from colonial times, plus globalization bringing everybody's cultures to be more similar to one another. However, you notice that looking not even that closely, black people are, relatively speaking, not faring very well socio-economically, despite being one of the most established ethnic groups in Britain, especially in the case of West Indians who've been here for a very long time. In wealth data from the ONS Wealth and Asset Survey covering 2010 to 2016, so labelled black Caribbean people had 20p relative to the white British pound, while black Africans were the joint poorest in the UK along with Bangladeshis, 10p per pound. The Swan Report of the 1980s and the Macpherson Report of the 90s were in response to racial discrimination and social exclusion of black people. It has been argued that the second generation have not seen an improvement on their circumstances, relatively speaking, to those that prompted their parents to leave back home in the first place. To be honest, black people are faring socio-economically worse than the branches of extended family that rolled the dice and ended up settling in the United States instead. Therefore, for those of us in the second generation and beyond, we may view the lands of our parents and grandparents as a way out, a survival strategy, an alternative way to achieve socio-economic mobility and belonging. But who gets to return though? From Tracy Reynolds' study, generally those among the second generation onwards who get to return are either uni graduates or else hold some other kind of professional skill set. They also still have active links with family in the Caribbean prior to relocating. Therefore, for those people who are impacted negatively by the social structures and socio-economic issues that a lot of returnees cite as the thing they're trying to avoid, well, those people also can't find a new beginning in the Caribbean either because of those very same structural issues. If you've had limited education, if you've had other issues, it's going to make it harder for you to migrate to another country. Having lost ties with homeland-based family also massively impacts the feasibility of relocating because you need connections to be able to settle in well and find employment. Class and financial indicators are also at play here, such as the ability to travel frequently between here and back home in order to make those connections more meaningful. Conventional research tends to hold the view that, in contrast with the negative effects of brain drain, diasporans returning is a beneficial result of labour migration. When people leave, they acquire capital, and then when they return, they can reinvest that capital back into the country. Some see it that second generation and beyond migration into the Caribbean allows cross-generational wealth, and there are indeed government and privately backed schemes set up to attract descendants to relocate to the Caribbean. Me personally, I've encountered certain schemes like that, and I'm sure many others have as well. In the last year alone, I've attended at least one virtual workshop held by the Jamaica High Commission, which was around helping people figure out how to obtain citizenship by descent. Upon returning, the first generation tend to concentrate in established returnee communities, while the second generation and beyond tend to spread out more and live among everybody else rather than settling in known expat communities. However, do returnees really live the same as everybody else? Taking examples from interviewees in Jamaica, they were able to hit the ground running socio-economically. They can afford to send their kids to private school, which avoids the variable quality in state education. The general view among both Jamaicans and returnees is that they are indeed outsiders. Yes, they recognise that they're insiders in the context of their families, and they can draw upon their transnational upbringing to help them familiarise themselves with their new surroundings, but the obvious cultural differences between them and those raised there, including those very same family members, rendered them outsiders nonetheless, a status that often comes with privilege rather than disadvantage. The second generation were mostly at peace with this, but the first generation, who identity-wise still very much felt like insiders due to also being born and raised there, expected a seamless transition and automatic reacceptance, only to be confronted with the same outsider status that their children and grandchildren had who were born abroad. Similar conflict was found among the African research group, where some of the first generation who had gone back ended up coming back to the UK because the UK ended up feeling more like home than back home did. And also, as far as homeland visits go, they do strengthen transnational ties to an extent, but it does get tricky when those in the homeland exclude those born overseas and don't really accept them. Multiple second generation participants in the African research group therefore found that it was religion, Islam specifically, that was the easiest part of their identities to prioritise, because to claim either their Britishness or their ancestral homeland identity was fraught with rejection and exclusion, although they did say that they had an internal sense of their own Britishness without it necessarily being affected by what others or society put on them. In the West Indian research group, the second generation returnees were often confronted with a lot of social and structural things that they hadn't really thought about or knew about before they got there. But why didn't they know? This is a common thing with returnees going back home, wherever it is. In this case, muse with me for a second. Let's take a look at how things were in the Caribbean at the time of their parents' and grandparents' exit, taking Jamaica, which featured in the study, as an example. This is one of a couple of rabbit holes that we'll be going down in this video, so enjoy! As described in Walter Rodney's The Groundings with My Brothers, the period following emancipation saw the consolidation of white wealth and power as the risk of a labour vacuum loomed. The brutal suppression of Paul Bogle's revolt in 1865 gave way for the British to remove the constitution entirely and place it under the direct control of the colonial office, stopping the transition of power to black people dead in its tracks. The colonial office continued colonialing for many years, but in 1938, 100 years after the end of slavery, more labour revolts across the Caribbean sprung up as black people felt anything but free. After World War II, the British decided that the only things worth keeping were the strategic advantages that the region gave it with its big American neighbour, and even more resources to exploit. At the time, there were many independence movements across the globe's imperialist systems, and the British knew that a move to self-rule was inevitable. So they formally gave up responsibility for the country's governance while retaining a great deal of soft, distant power. Even in this age of so-called self-rule, those who actually made up the ruling class were still either white elites or the multiracial bourgeoisie consisting of the brown upper middle classes, as well as other races of people and a small handful of black people. The racialized nature of class struggle had always been a very real threat to power, and therefore, in the lead up to independence, propaganda to create a new shared nationalistic identity as opposed to a racialized one began. The national motto, "Out of many, one people," was born out of this time. The concept of racial harmony and equality was sold to the Jamaican people while their circumstances did not materially change. For our Windrush generation, they were caught right at a really impressionable time, ranging in age from babies to young adults. For them, race took on a new meaning in their new home in Britain, where they were minoritized regardless of skin tone or racial admixture. And this is what they prioritized when teaching their own children about how to deal with race in the racist British society that was home, which makes sense. Recently, these differences in understanding played out with the controversial White Yardie interview on Channel 4's Unapologetic, in which a black British guest challenged White Yardie on whether he's considered part of black culture and when he decided to be Jamaican, despite the fact that he was born to a Jamaican national and went back over there at the age of 3 months and was born and well, not born, but he was raised there, came back over here as a grown man. The show's co-host, ZZ Mills, whose grandparents are from Jamaica, had to defend him and say that he probably knows more about Jamaican culture than she does.
Do you believe that you are part of black culture?
I believe I'm a part of the Jamaican culture.
Okay.
What's the difference to you?
The difference to me is that what is the black culture, you cannot just define black culture as black culture because it varies. I relate with the Jamaican culture because it's a culture that I grew up in. You know, we have black British culture, so that's a different thing. But to me, black British culture is a merge of like Jamaican, Caribbean, and Africa and England together. That makes the black British culture. That's what I would say. But I cannot define in one sentence to say, this is black culture, because it's...
Can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
When did you decide that you were Jamaican? Was it when you came back over here? Was it when someone asked you? Like, was there an experience where you just felt, I identify as a Jamaican man?
Once she had me and did the checks, 3 months on a plane back to Jamaica. So from there until what I know has been that. Yeah. It's just what's inside. You understand what I mean, brother?
To call yourself a Jamaican, that's interesting. Because you said that you weren't born there, but I guess if the community to which you kind of were raised in, which is Jamaica, obviously, if they've embraced you, the large swaths of them and stuff, and if you've got citizenship, I don't know if you have, but yeah, from where I come...
Harry, do you have a Jamaican passport?
Yes, I do.
So I find it interesting as well, because how do you decide? My grandparents are from Jamaica, my dad's born there, my mum was born here. You probably would know more about Jamaica than me, just because I'm black now. No one, if I said I'm Jamaican, no one's going to question me. It is, you're just Jamaican.
Exactly.
But you probably know how to cook yard food, you know how to do all of that
my life.
better than me. So then who are we to tell him, actually, no, you're not Jamaican, just because he's white?
On social media, many in Jamaica, as well as the rest of the Caribbean, out of many one peopled the hell out of the diaspora, with some diasporans joining in. What I found interesting is that both the guest's ignorant challenge of White Yardie's identity and conflating it with race, as well as the national motto platitudes that were kind of predictable, kind of indicated two sides of the same ignorance when it comes to race and dynamics in the region. With everything I've just said about race dynamics, there are many who believe that their brothers and sisters abroad are race-obsessed, and this is actually often a sticking point in their dismissal of diasporans, with affinity placed on residence and citizenship instead. Anyway, while the Windrush generation were away, life went on, as it does. In the wake of constant political unrest, a wave of race consciousness swept the region once more in the 70s as Black Power took over. When the Windrush generation and their descendants return to Jamaica, they are often greeted with the legacy of all of this and more. Other things that returnees aren't necessarily aware of until they get there include the IMF national debt situation causing the government to spend nothing on its public services, explaining the educational issues that I mentioned earlier. Returnees would have also perhaps had some idea of the important customs situation if they ever had to send anything over there, but they've never been on the receiving end of any of it until they live there. Goods are kept expensive while salaries are kept low. All of this and more gives way to high levels of corruption and other social issues that everyone has to deal with, but ultimately, returnees can afford to circumnavigate in a way that many others can't. Alright, so I'm aware that I've probably gone into slightly too much detail to say that no, returnees do not live like the Jamaicans that have been there this whole time, and they are aware that they don't. Some of the reason why people in the homeland, be it Jamaica or anywhere else, may reject diasporans' identities, never mind whether it is theirs to accept or reject. Homeland is a deeply personal and subjective concept that can't necessarily be agreed with or disagreed with. It's because invariably they don't have to go through these experiences that dictate life for most of the population. Earlier, I made a point, didn't I, about how the second generation circumstances are going unimproved compared to whatever prompted their parents to leave the homeland in the first place. At face value, this is perhaps demonstrably false, given that the UK's economy is currently the 5th largest in the world. However, the environment that prompted their parents to leave, the thing that drives family back, and the thing that has kept many home nations underdeveloped are all interlinked and unfortunately are virtually inescapable. So moving on from that point, I was reading an article written by Ayi Stephen Diver detailing her experiences living in London's Nigerian community. As an Ijao woman, her first generation mother's phone calls to her aunts were the only opportunities her mother had to speak in her native tongue, because despite living in an area full of Nigerians, the UK community is mostly comprised of either Yoruba people or Igbo people. Indeed, among Nigerian diasporans and other Africans she met, none of them had heard of the Ijao people, despite the Ijao people making up the 4th largest ethnic group in Nigeria. This is an example of yet another gap in the experiences between those born in the homeland versus those born abroad. Ethnicity or tribe, depending on which you prefer, is a central element of Nigerian society, and there is absolutely no way of avoiding this if you live there. In the Nigerian community, tribe plays out to an extent. However, tribe has far less of a bearing here than it does within Nigeria. Another key difference in attitude between Nigerian diasporans and those living in the country can be felt most prominently perhaps when observing the flag-waving pan-Nigerian patriotism expressed in a way that only a diasporan would. The difference can be heart-wrenching when you consider the reasons why a Nigerian living in Nigeria may not be feeling particularly patriotic, given the state's crimes against its own people and the stress of just trying to get by. Finally, on this point, perhaps crucially, we have the case of remittances and the dynamics that they create between the homeland and overseas. Remittances maintain a sense of continued responsibility and therefore maintain connection to family and are a huge part of what keeps the poor and working classes back home going. However, remittances are also a significant source of tension and resentment, which can eventually ruin families and destroy transnational ties. Adediran Daniel Ikoomula's 2013 to 2014 study, with 37 participants who'd left Nigeria and were back for the holidays, describes their feelings around themes like the misuse of money they send back, the demands and expectations placed on them by their extended family, and the extreme pressure they face financially, especially because they often don't hit the ground running when they get to their host nations. 2/3 of participants said that they had been sent away by their families to work. One heartbreaking example describes a woman who had been sent to Italy and ended up being sex trafficked. In the study, the participants suspected that her parents knew what they were getting into all along. Remittances are fraught with power imbalances in each direction. In Peggy Levitt's work, she can see that immigrants can and do exploit their kin networks via class distinction. More prosperous relatives can take labour from their kin, and their children can and do benefit from these class distinctions and these ties, especially if they ever wish to return. That said, to be more prosperous comes with problems such as mistrust and suspicion, and many live in fear of those who envy them or may be plotting against them. If things go sour, remittances can eventually create a situation where those who migrated are rejected by those who stayed behind, and conversely, those who left can cut ties with those at home. Almost everybody I know, myself included, has a story like this somewhere in their families. In all of the examples I provided, diasporans are seen as not quite belonging in their lands of origin due to obvious differences in culture and upbringing, as well as how those differences play out, particularly in the privileges they provide when they spend time at home. Dynamics between the diaspora and home nation can be quite tense in expressing their identity, their birthright, their entitlement, depending on which of the many angles you can opt to take. In belonging to their lands of origin, the second generation also get to flex their global north foreign privilege. Despite all of this, however, as well as emotional reasons for wanting to continue to identify nationally with their countries even after 2 or 3 generations, there are also structural differences, as diasporans are also excluded from Britishness, both culturally and systemically, and this goes back a long time. So let's look at that in more detail. Britishness as a term began to be used in the 18th century upon the formation of the Kingdom of Great Britain in 1707 and was bound up in Protestantism. However, Britishness wasn't really a thing in public discourse until the 20th century. Enoch Powell, a politician who belonged to both the Tory party and the Ulster Unionist Party in his time, went down in race relations history when in 1968 he delivered his Rivers of Blood speech in opposition to Commonwealth immigration and the proposed race relations bill. This speech implied that there were waves and waves of immigrants entering the UK, causing the deprioritisation and squeezing out of white people who were being made, quote, strangers in their own country. Here, Britishness was being explicitly conflated with whiteness. While senior party members were outraged by Powell's actions and he was eventually sacked by then Conservative leader Edward Heath, imagine that now with the present-day Tories. 75% of the British public were actually reportedly in favour of his speech, and he immediately gained support from the far right. Almost 40 years later, then Chancellor of the Exchequer Gordon Brown made a speech promoting Britishness in 2006, taking the opportunity to portray the Labour Party as a patriotic party. In his speech, he urged the party's supporters to embrace the Union flag. This was in the aftermath of the 7/7 bombings, which took place in London on the 7th of July 2005, and where 52 victims and 4 terrorists died. Brown's point was to emphasise the united shared sense of purpose to try and reclaim images of nationalism from the likes of the British National Party and other far-right groups. His point being that those who committed the bombings were British citizens doing it to other British citizens. However, as part of his efforts, that same year Brown also introduced Veterans Day, now known as Armed Forces Day, to take place annually. So, historically, the ways in which the public came together collectively to celebrate national pride tended to fall along the lines of either celebrating the empire, which is no longer a thing, celebrating the pageantry of the royal family, which is still a thing, or through celebrating the military, which, although tied up in royalist imagery, fell out of favour after the fallout of World War II. Because despite being on the victorious side, the UK had been devastated completely by the effects of 2 major world wars within 30 years, as was indeed the rest of Europe. Presently, Armed Forces Day attract protests from pacifists and the like, not least because the British military complex is responsible for so much unrest in the world. Take Remembrance Sunday, Armistice Day, and the month of November, which began as periods of solemn reflection on the destructive and wasteful nature of war, but have become highly divisive and a proxy in the so-called culture war of what is and is not Britishness, leaving many minorities, including black people, feeling excluded from participating because of the deliberate omission of our historic contributions, despite much campaigning and awareness raising. Another aspect of Britishness are the so-called fundamental British values, which are defined in the Prevent strategy as the rule of law, individual liberty, democracy, and the mutual respect, tolerance, and understanding of different beliefs and faiths. I'll hold that thought on the Prevent strategy for now, but these values predate it, and tolerance can essentially be seen as like the precursor to multiculturalism or diversity and inclusion. It still comes up quite a lot, although it's a bit old-fashioned now at this point, I guess. And it's also something that I personally find quite amusing, because to be tolerated isn't to be liked or loved, is it? Anyway, can Britishness be quantified and tested? Well, apparently yes, it can. We have the Life in the UK test, an online multiple choice test which is a requirement for anyone who has applied for either indefinite leave to remain or naturalisation. Its 24 questions ask things like where Robert Burns was from, who built the Tower of London, that was one I got wrong, it's William the Conqueror, not Henry VII, oops, where the cenotaph is related, which is another one that I got wrong, it's in Whitehall, not Trafalgar Square, another oops, and other questions apparently pertinent to living a life of success and assimilation in the UK. So I failed the mock test. The pass threshold is 75% and I got like 70. Apparently this is pretty typical for British citizens. In a University of Essex study, 2/3 of those who took the test also failed miserably. The questions have been criticised and seen as a mockery. As a label, a 2007 study showed that non-white Brits are actually more likely than their white counterparts to identify as British, but far less likely to ID as English, Scottish or Welsh. I wonder why they didn't include Northern Irish or Irish in this. Probably because the situation is a lot different, it's unique in Northern Ireland, and British and Irish carry different meanings over there. Only 1/3 of white British people actually refer to themselves as British. I mean, this was in 2007, so I wonder if things have changed much, but at any rate, it aligns with my own experiences. The only non-white person that I can think of kicking up any kind of fuss about wanting to be called English is David Lammy. I also have observed a difference in the way Black Scottish people identify. I feel like they're more likely to identify as Scottish as Black people in England would with being English. And I have a feeling this has to do with the political dynamics, because everywhere in the UK has been increasingly distancing itself from Westminster, and by extension London, and by extension England, although obviously England hasn't been distancing itself from England, but it has been from London. And no, I'm not going to get into this, I'm not going to get into Cornwall, I'm not going to get into the regional dynamics. Nope. Instead, let's move on from Britishness and let's talk about nationality. Are you ready for the highlight of your day? A run through of the history of British nationality? Good, I knew it. So essentially it finds its origins in feudal medieval England, back when people were considered subjects of the crown if they were born within the crown's dominion. Centuries later, the creation of the empire in the Elizabethan era meant that the concept of subject was extended to the territories, and in the early days, just being born within its boundaries meant that you became a subject, just solely. So it operates in a similar manner to how citizenship is in the United States right now, for example. Skipping over another few centuries now, the British Nationality Act 1948 defined citizenship of both the UK and colonies, classing inhabitants of both under one single definition of British citizenship. Between 1948 and 1962, 500,000 non-white British subjects of the colonies entered the UK under this definition. This is what Enoch Powell was referring to in his speech. I'd argue that popular perception of this time is that the legislation was on the back of the invitation extended to the empire's men and women to find a home in the mother country in exchange for labour in rebuilding mother country after World War II. However, this actually was not the motivation behind this momentous change, and the law was created in spite of open reluctance that the establishment had with the idea of opening its doors to a bunch of non-white immigrants. Indeed, the government, no sooner had they created the law, distanced themselves from it as much as they could, as did the opposition. No, what actually happened was the passing of the Canadian Citizenship Act 1946, because it undermined the uniformity of British subjecthood within the Commonwealth and Empire to which Canada belonged. In 1945, Canada's then Prime Minister Mackenzie King announced plans to introduce a new law defining Canadian citizenship and declaring that all would, going forward, possess British subject status. This marked the end of a centuries-long definition which, as I'd said earlier, ultimately pulled from feudalism, wherein everything within the realm of the Lord belonged to the Lord, combined with the Roman approach to a borderless empire. The British Nationality and Status of Allies Act 1914 defined a British subject as anyone born or paternally descended within His Majesty's dominions and allegiance. A series of amendments followed to reiterate this, and the Imperial Conference of 1921 reaffirmed Dominion autonomy in their own immigration control. The Dominions in this case being the Empire's self-governing nations of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Newfoundland, South Africa and the Irish Free State. An agreement was made that they maintained autonomy as long as any exceptions to the overarching common code would be minor and rare. A few incidences did happen where these nations contradicted the agreement, but none challenged their equality in law under the UK until the passing of the Canadian Citizenship Act 1946. So, essentially, the British Nationality Act in 1948 was a response to this and was a way of once more reaffirming uniformity in law across the Empire and Commonwealth. Crucially, it was also a way of reaffirming British dominance.
Invited to Britain to do certain jobs on the buses and the underground, in the sweatshops, in the foundries, in the hospitals. We did the dirty jobs, the uncomfortable jobs, for low pay.
When people from across the Commonwealth accepted the invitation and started to move into the UK, they were considered British subjects and their legal status was citizens of the United Kingdom and Colonies, or CUKC. They had automatic right to live and work without any paperwork. It would be like if I just decided to relocate to Swansea. I could, even though Swansea is in Wales and I'm in England. Anyway, things changed with the introduction of the Commonwealth Immigrants Act 1962, meaning that CUKC holders lost their citizenship once their home nation gained independence. although they retained their British subject and Commonwealth status. Then, when the Immigration Act 1971 was enforced on the 1st of January 1973, it confirmed that anyone who was already settled before that date was entitled to remain indefinitely, and crucially, there was no requirement for them to register with the Home Office. Restrictions were then placed on migration into the UK from the Commonwealth, despite Commonwealth citizens not being considered foreign in British law even today. The British Nationality Act 1981 determined that the right to abode was only held by British citizens and a small category of Commonwealth citizens. Then, from 2012 onwards, the Home Office introduced a range of policies and measures referred to as the hostile environment, taking the term from a microbiological context to do with bacteria. Under the then Home Secretary Theresa May, the hostile environment was fairly self-explanatory: to make the lives of those without indefinite leave to remain as difficult as possible, hopefully prompting them to leave of their own accord. Some of these measures included blocking access to healthcare via the NHS, blocking access to education, employment and renting, and blocking the ability to open a bank account, among others. Many of those affected were British and Commonwealth citizens, and many of these had been children when they came over, whose lack of documentation combined with the Home Office either having been lax in keeping records or having deliberately destroyed them. The burden of proof, however, remained with these people to provide proof and paperwork of every year they'd lived in the UK. By 2018, the so-called Windrush Scandal broke out in the press to the general public that this had affected thousands of people who'd been detained, deported, or denied their rights. In response to international criticism and pressure for immigration reform, an independent review was commissioned by the Home Office. In accepting the recommendations from this review, they put together the Windrush Compensation Scheme. 2019 estimations saw that about 15,000 people would probably be eligible. As of August 2021, 2,761 claims have been received, and just 837 claims have received anything. And there are valid reasons for the low uptake, including a mistrust, given the fact that this is not being run independently but by the very department that caused the problem in the first place, as well as delays for those who do go for the scheme, putting other people off. As far as the human impact this has had, people have lost their jobs, people have lost their homes, they've lost access to children and grandchildren. They were and still are being moved to countries that they haven't seen in decades. They had no access to benefits and no way of earning money, and they also had restricted access to healthcare. As of May 2021, 21 affected victims died waiting for justice, including prominent campaigner Paulette Wilson, who died in 2020 aged just 64. She arrived from Jamaica at the age of 10 years old. This also didn't just affect people from the Caribbean, but from across the Commonwealth, including 49 people who were deported to Ghana and Nigeria in 2017. This is an explicit example of the conditional nature of Britishness and exclusion from it as perpetuated by the state. In August 2020, 34-year-old Mercy Begum was found dead in a Glasgow flat after the cries of her malnourished one-year-old could be heard from outside. Mercy, an asylum seeker from Uganda, had lost her job after her right-to-work status had expired, leaving her as no recourse to public funds. No recourse to public funds, or NRPF, is a person subject to immigration control as defined by legislation introduced by Tony Blair's government. Under these controls, a person cannot claim public funds such as benefits or housing unless an exception has been made. An asylum seeker is someone who has asked for asylum and is awaiting a decision as to whether or not they meet the threshold for refugee. Refugees have recourse to public funds, but asylum seekers do not. According to the 1951 Refugee Convention, it is not a requirement for people to remain in the first safe country that they arrive at. In theory, they can apply wherever they like. It is also not illegal to do this. Nevertheless, asylum seekers have been the ones allowed to die in the Channel for this reason, while the UK and its continental neighbours dispute the above, and despite the fact that European powers like the UK have been instrumental in destabilising many of the nations these people are escaping from.
In all of the awful answers the Minister has given, he's not shown one iota of empathy for desperate people putting their own lives at risk in order to try to get to a place of safety, many of them coming from war zones around the world that Britain has been involved in. Can he not show some humanity and sympathy to these people? Come to a European-wide agreement on support for asylum seekers and refugees. Look at the sources of why people come, and look at the awful conditions that many face when they arrive in this country.
According to the Home Office, African applicants are more than twice as likely to be refused a UK visa compared to applicants from other parts of the world. Take in 2020, for example, where 43% of visit visa applications from Ghana for both business and tourism were refused, compared with just 4% from Colombia. Just one example of this very stark disparity. These refusals represent a culture of disbelief and a lack of benefit of the doubt within the Home Office, who see visitors from Africa as likely overstayers. And it doesn't even matter if applicants submit evidence to the contrary, because this evidence is dismissed as not credible. In 2020, advocacy and pressure group Detention Action conducted an analysis which showed in 2019, 90% of Australian nationals who'd ended up detained by immigration were released within 28 days, compared with just 40% of Jamaican nationals and 60% of Nigerian nationals. 90% of Canadians were released within 7 days, compared with just 17% of Zimbabweans. It's important to note that the UK is the only European country that does not have a time limit on detentions, meaning that some people end up held for years. When speaking on the findings, Detention Action's director, Bella Sankey, called the detention and deportation system institutionally racist. Now, all of the examples that I've just given are examples of exclusion. And looking back at Louise Waite and Joanne Cook's study, where some participants had been refugees or asylum seekers, there was a relationship between immigration status and levels of inclusion and exclusion because of the different rights afforded. So, the prevent strategy that I talked about earlier was introduced by Tony Blair's government in the 2000s following September the 11th and the 7/7 bombings. Terrorism overwhelmingly happens in places other than Great Britain, including its neighbour and fellow constituent of the UK, Northern Ireland, which continues to experience dozens of paramilitary shootings and bombings. And between 2006 and 2016 saw 26 people die, compared with 2 people over here during the same period. Nevertheless, the prevent strategy was enshrined in legislation anyway, having been made a statutory requirement for public bodies by the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act 2015, introduced by Home Secretary Theresa May under then Prime Minister David Cameron. It not only targets, but exists specifically to focus on extremism committed by so-called Islamists, therefore fueling Islamophobia and demonizing Islam and Muslims. This era has seen the mainstreaming of more overt xenophobia and racism. For example, the rise of the United Kingdom Independence Party, or UKIP, part of a broader anti-immigration and populist shift across Europe, which found its beginnings with France's Front National, now known as the National Rally or the Rassemblement National, which was established by Jean-Marie Le Pen in 1972. Shamima Begum was a case that immediately piqued my interest when I first started hearing about it. When she was 15 years old, Shamima, who grew up in Tower Hamlets in East London, which is not too far away from where I grew up in East London, left to go and join the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant in Syria. When she attempted to return to the UK in 2019, public debate erupted on what to do with returning extremists. That same year, acting on behalf of the British government, current Home Secretary Priti Patel personally revoked Shamima's citizenship. In 2020, the Court of Appeal ruled that Shamima Begum should be allowed to re-enter the UK in order to contest the decision in person, but the Supreme Court reversed this ruling in 2021. Shamima Begum is second generation via her parents, who are immigrants from Bangladesh. She herself does not possess Bangladeshi citizenship, but she was entitled to it, and this is one of the reasons cited for justification in revoking her citizenship, although Bangladesh has since gone on record to say that no, they will not be granting her citizenship, which I don't blame them. Shamima Begum, a 15-year-old schoolchild who, through social exclusion, structural oppression, and negligent and under-resourced education and social care systems, ended up radicalized. She was born in 1999 and has never really known a time without the demonization of Muslims being everywhere. I am not going to debate on the morality of what she did, because this is not the point of what I'm saying here. The point I'm trying to make is that A, the circumstances that created her do not exist in Bangladesh. They are as British as she is. And B, she shares many characteristics with many people in the UK, black people included. Yes, she is second generation and she is descended from post-war migration from the Commonwealth. Her ethnic group is also well established in the UK, having been here for a long time, much like the West Indian community. The Bangladeshi community also enjoy very little social mobility or socioeconomic success. They are the poorest ethnicity in the UK, and 61% of their children are raised in poverty, compared with over 50% of black children. This is in spite of their high levels of educational attainment, yet another L for the case of respectability politics. I often hear black people who've either been born here or who've lived here a long time act like matters of immigration don't affect them because of the fact that we've been here a long time. Me too, I guess. I'm, generation 2.5? One parent moved here, one parent was born here. You tell me, what does that make me? The Shamima Begum case, however, terrorism aside, I know, it's a weird sentence, whatever, is relevant to all of us, no matter how much we feel we fit in. And it all just got a whole lot more real recently because...
Happy New Year. The start of a new year is always a special time to reflect upon the previous year, but also to look ahead to what we want to achieve in the year to come. I know that 2021 has had its difficulty for many of us, but there is so much that I am proud to have been able to deliver as your Home Secretary, but there is still much more to do. This year it is vital that our police and crime bill passes through Parliament. The bill will introduce mandatory life sentences for those who kill an emergency worker in the course of their duty, and also crack down on the so-called eco-protesters on our roads and motorways that have caused misery to the law-abiding public. I will also continue to prioritise fixing our broken asylum system. It has been untouched for 2 decades, but passing our Borders Bill into law in 2022 will finally give us the powers we need to deliver long overdue change. A fairer system, deterring illegal entry across the Channel by cracking down on people smugglers and ending the legal merry-go-round of spurious asylum claims is what the British people expect, and we will deliver. And I know we've got a lot of work to do in 2022, so let's get to it.
The Nationality and Borders Bill, currently being introduced by Priti Patel, will introduce, among other things, the ability to revoke citizenship without warning, which will potentially affect over 6 million people, although to be honest, I think this estimation is actually a bit low. The Home Office's position is that citizenship is a privilege and not a right, which is directly contradictory in terms of the Declaration of Human Rights, which states that citizenship is not only a right, but should never be removed arbitrarily. As it stands, it's already been possible to revoke citizenship for people who hold dual or multiple citizenship if it's deemed in the public interest to do so. Historically, the Home Secretary could only remove citizenship from either a naturalised citizen or someone with citizenship by registration, and only if they had committed treason. Being born here meant that your citizenship absolutely could not be revoked under any circumstances, no matter how much beef the state had with you. Citizenship also couldn't be removed if it would leave the person stateless, as is currently the case with Shamima Begum. Indeed, between 1973 and 2002, it wasn't invoked at all. However, over the last 20 years or so, there's been a gradual relaxation of the restrictions, and in 2014, Theresa May introduced the ability to revoke citizenship if you were eligible for citizenship elsewhere, not just if you actually held citizenship, which is why I think the 6 million figure is actually quite low. In reaction to the Channel crossings, this new bill will also recategorise asylum seekers into 2 groups. Group 1, who arrive directly into the UK and upon arrival immediately present themselves to the authorities, and Group 2 for everybody else. Their rights and assessments will be dealt with differently based on these 2 groups as well. Currently, as I mentioned earlier, according to international law, it is not illegal to pass through several states before presenting yourself for asylum. And so this is again in contravention with international law. Over the way in France now, something similar actually happened in the 2010s, where plans were drafted up to revoke the citizenship of people with dual nationality if they were deemed terrorists. There was and still is a sharp uptick in populism and right-wing politics in the country, and while this was all happening, 49% of the French people were in favour of this controversial constitutional amendment. However, in 2016, then President François Hollande ultimately scrapped the plan due to the enormous amount of opposition within his own party. However, French politics continues to have lots of room for populism and right-wing nationalism, with the popularity of Marine Le Pen, Éric Zemmour and Valérie Pécresse, who are all presidential candidates in this year's election. I mentioned France because, as I said before, their anti-immigrant rise in populism was among the first in Europe, and it's been argued probably sparked it off everywhere else. So many thanks to the Front National and the Le Pen family for that one. I think the similarities in history between this country and France, in terms of its global position and internal dynamics, in some ways, not all, are not discussed enough. So I was actually set off into making this video after I was watching a video by the storyteller on Black British when he made this point.
British identity, despite the liberal rhetoric to the contrary, is obviously seen as synonymous with whiteness. Modern British identity grew with and was shaped by fundamentally and undeniably a racist British Empire. You know what's wild? It's like you would assume people would talk about this. Like you would assume people in and outside the UK would care, but they don't. It's isolating, it's lonely, and it creates an identity of invisibility.
The Brits claim us when we're winning things for them, but they reject us ordinarily, and even after several generations you will still be told to go back home. Our Britishness is fickle and conditional. But then, the people back home don't necessarily claim you either, especially if you don't have anything for them. Both sides can overstep too many boundaries in response to how we see ourselves, when the only people who can really determine that are us ourselves and nobody else. I wonder how other black people in Europe feel about this. Please, if you're watching this, any of you, I'd like to know. This video was rather heavy, I admit that, so if you're still here, first of all, thank you for sticking with me. Secondly, if there's anything that you'd like me to talk about in more detail that I've touched upon today, let me know in the comments below. Also, as well as my usual references and reading material that I include in my description, I'm also going to include some resources if you want to know more just in general, some petitions, that kind of thing. Anyway, thank you for watching.